On June 3, 1988, 7-year-old Amber Swartz was jumping rope in her front yard in Pinole, California. 15 minutes later, the yard was empty. Amber was never seen again. What happened in that brief window shattered one family and unsettled an entire community. This is the story of 15 minutes that changed everything and the decades of searching that followed. Where are you watching from? Pinole in 1988 was the kind of place where parents still felt safe. Tucked into Contra Costa County's East Bay region, this small city of 17,000 people served as a bedroom community for San Francisco workers who wanted affordable homes and good schools. Front yards had swing sets. Sidewalks saw children riding bikes until the streetlights came on. Neighbors knew each other's names and waved from their driveways. The Pinole Police Department was small enough that officers lived in the neighborhoods they patrolled. When Bernie Swartz put on his badge each morning, he was protecting his own community. His neighbors trusted him. His daughter would grow up safe here. Except Bernie Swartz never met his daughter. On May 30, 1980, Officer Swartz was pursuing a parolee through the streets of Pinole when gunfire erupted. He was 30 years old when he fell. His wife Kim was 22 and 5 months pregnant. She became a widow before she became a mother, and the baby growing inside her would be born into a community that remembered her father as a hero. Amber Jean Swartz arrived on August 19, 1980. She had blonde hair and blue eyes, and a smile that made the officers at the Pinole Police Department stop by the house just to check on Bernie's girls. Kim eventually began living with Al Garcia, and Amber used his last name for school, but legally, she remained Amber Jean Swartz. She was the daughter of a fallen officer in a town that had promised to protect her. By the time Amber was 7, she was a fixture on Savage Avenue. She was small for her age, standing just 4 feet tall and weighing 62 pounds. She wore a hearing aid because she'd been born with a hearing impairment, though she'd become remarkably skilled at reading lips. When she lost her right front tooth that spring, Kim teased her about the gap in her smile. It was such a normal 7-year-old thing, losing that tooth. Everything about their life felt normal. The neighborhood itself reflected the innocence of that era. Savage Avenue was lined with modest single-family homes, each with a patch of lawn and a driveway where fathers washed their cars on Saturday mornings. The park behind the Swartz home was the kind of place where Little League games drew crowds, and summer evenings meant children catching fireflies in jars. People didn't lock their doors during the day. They didn't worry about strangers, because there were no strangers, only neighbors they hadn't met yet. This sense of security was particularly strong for the Swartz family. Bernie's sacrifice had woven them into the fabric of Pinole's law enforcement community. When Kim needed help, officers appeared. When Amber walked to school, patrol cars slowed down to wave. The implicit promise was clear. We couldn't save Bernie, but we'll protect his family. We'll keep his daughter safe. That's what made Friday, June 3rd so devastating. It started like any other day. It would be the last ordinary day they would ever have. The morning unfolded with the easy rhythm of early summer. School was out. The California sun warmed Savage Avenue early, promising a hot afternoon. Amber moved through the house in her purple corduroy pants and white top with the teal bands around the neck and sleeves. There was a sunglasses design printed on the front. She pulled on her white sneakers, the ones with the pink laces she'd chosen herself at the store. Kim can't remember now what they had for breakfast. She's tried over the years to recall that detail, to hold on to something concrete from those last hours. But the ordinary moments don't stay sharp in memory. They dissolve like morning fog, and all that remains is the awful clarity of what came after. What Kim does remember is the jump rope. It wasn't a child's toy with plastic handles and colorful beads. This was an adult-sized rope with a leather cord and solid wooden handles. Amber had been practicing with it all week, determined to master the rhythm. The rope was almost too heavy for her small arms, but she refused to give up. That determination was pure Amber, that stubborn streak that made her practice something over and over until she got it right. The morning passed in the unremarkable way that mornings do when you have nowhere urgent to be. Maybe there was cartoons on television. Maybe Amber played with toys in her room. Maybe Kim folded laundry or made phone calls or simply enjoyed the quiet of having her daughter home for the summer. These are the details that slip away because they seemed so unimportant at the time. How could anyone know that in a few hours Kim would desperately wish she could remember every single second? Sometime that afternoon, Amber asked if she could go outside to practice in the front yard. Kim hesitated. She'd later tell reporters about that hesitation, that moment of reluctance she couldn't quite explain. Why had she paused? What instinct had whispered a warning she didn't heed? But it was a beautiful day. Savage Avenue was quiet. Other children played outside on the block. This was Pinole. This was safe. Okay, Kim said, but stay where I can see you from the window. Amber grabbed the jump rope and pushed through the front door. The screen door slapped shut behind her. Kim heard the rope begin its rhythmic slapping against the pavement. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound of a normal summer afternoon. Kim went back to whatever she'd been doing inside. Dishes maybe. Laundry. The mundane tasks that fill a Friday when you're a single mother trying to keep a household running. She checked on Amber through the window. Blonde hair bouncing. The rope turning. Everything normal. Everything fine. 15 minutes passed. Maybe less. Time becomes unreliable in trauma, stretching and compressing until you can't trust your own memory of its passage. But it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes before Kim went to check again. The front yard was empty. Kim stepped outside, expecting to see Amber next door or across the street. Children drift. They see a friend and wander over. They follow a cat or chase a ball that's rolled away. Amber, she called the name once casually. Her voice carried the mild annoyance of a mother whose child has moved beyond the agreed-upon boundaries. But the jump rope was gone too. A child might wander off to visit a neighbor, but she wouldn't take the jump rope. The rope was too heavy, too awkward for a 7-year-old to carry around. Its absence meant something different. It meant Amber hadn't walked away on her own. That's when Kim started running. Door to door along Savage Avenue, her voice rising with each unanswered call. Have you seen Amber? Has anyone seen my daughter? Neighbors emerged onto their porches, their faces shifting from confusion to concern to fear. Within minutes, a dozen people were searching yards and garages and the spaces between houses where children sometimes hide. Someone called the Pinole Police Department. When the dispatcher heard the address, heard the name Swartz, the response was immediate. This was Bernie's daughter. This was one of their own. Every available unit rolled toward Savage Avenue, sirens cutting through the summer afternoon. By the time the first police car pulled into the driveway, Amber had been missing for perhaps 30 minutes. By nightfall, those minutes would become hours, and the hours would stretch into years. But in that moment, as the sun still hung high over Savage Avenue, everyone believed they would find her. They had to find her. How far could a 7-year-old girl get in half an hour? The answer, it turned out, was farther than anyone imagined possible. The Pinole Police Department mobilized with the intensity of a force-protecting family, because that's what Amber was to them. Officers who had attended Bernie Swartz's funeral 8 years earlier now walked the same streets he'd once patrolled searching for his daughter. Neighboring agencies sent support. Volunteers poured in from across the East Bay. By evening, hundreds of people were searching. They started with the immediate area. Every yard on Savage Avenue was searched multiple times. Garages, sheds, crawl spaces under porches. The park behind the Swartz home received particular attention. There was a baseball diamond there, playground equipment, trees that could hide a small body. Search dogs traced scents in looping patterns but couldn't establish a clear trail beyond the park's boundaries. Kim walked alongside the searchers, her voice hoarse from calling Amber's name. What was her daughter wearing? The white top with teal bands, purple corduroy pants despite the warm weather, white sneakers with pink laces, gold and emerald earrings, a hearing aid in her left ear, missing her right front tooth. Every detail mattered. Every detail was broadcast to the growing crowd of volunteers. The hearing aid detail troubled investigators particularly. Amber's impairment meant she might not hear someone approaching from behind. She might not hear a car pulling up beside her. If her hearing aid had been turned off or had malfunctioned, she would have been especially vulnerable. The perpetrator might not have even needed to be quiet. He could have walked right up to her while she focused on the jump rope and she wouldn't have heard his footsteps. As darkness fell on June 3rd, someone brought in portable lights. The search continued through the night. Flashlight beams swept through bushes and under parked cars. No one wanted to stop. Stopping meant admitting they might not find her before morning. Stopping meant considering possibilities too terrible to speak aloud. They found nothing. No torn clothing caught on a fence, no dropped shoe, no jump rope lying abandoned in the grass. It was as if Amber had simply dissolved into the afternoon air, taking that adult-sized leather rope with her. The absence of evidence was itself evidence of something chilling. Most child abductions are disorganized, impulsive acts that leave traces, a struggle, a witness, something dropped or torn or out of place. But this abduction had been executed with precision. The perpetrator had taken Amber and the jump rope in broad daylight from a residential street and left nothing behind. That level of efficiency suggested either extraordinary luck or careful planning. But when dawn broke on June 4th, when exhausted searchers returned to the park behind the Swartz home, something was there that hadn't been the night before. A pair of pink socks lay near the baseball diamond. Kim identified them immediately. Those were Amber's socks. She'd worn them the day before on June 2nd, but they hadn't been in the park when volunteers had scoured that exact spot the previous evening. Someone had come back during the night. Someone had walked into an active search area while families slept, and investigators planned the next day's efforts. Someone had placed those socks there deliberately. The psychological implications made investigators' skin crawl. This wasn't a crime of opportunity that had gone wrong. This was someone who wanted to participate in the investigation, who wanted to watch the pain unfold, who found satisfaction in planting evidence and observing the chaos it created. The searcher had become part of the search. In the psychology of those who take children, this behavior pointed toward a particular type of personality. Someone organized enough to pull off a daylight abduction with no witnesses. Someone confident enough to return to an active crime scene. Someone who lived close enough to walk into that park unnoticed, or who had a reason to be in the neighborhood that wouldn't raise suspicion. The planted socks also sent a message. I'm still here. I'm watching you. I can move through your investigation at will. The cruelty of it was stunning. Kim and her supporters had spent the entire night searching that park, desperate for any sign of Amber. And while they searched, the person who'd taken her daughter had been close enough to walk into that same park and leave a taunt. Investigators began looking more carefully at the people who'd shown up to help search. They examined the volunteers' faces in news footage. They noted who asked too many questions, who seemed too interested in the details of the investigation, who appeared more excited than appropriately concerned. And just 3 days after Amber disappeared, a man from Oakland named Timothy Bindner knocked on Kim Swartz's door. I'd like to help you find your daughter, he said. Timothy Bindner was impossible to forget once you'd met him. He drove a van plastered with missing children posters. Not just one or two, but dozens of faces staring out from every panel. Inside the van were folders, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes about cases across the Bay Area. Binder could recite details about disappearances going back years. He knew the names, the dates, the circumstances. He made it his business to know, and he made it his business to visit the families. Kim was desperate for help, desperate for any lead. When Bindner offered his assistance, she accepted. He seemed to care. He seemed to understand the unique agony of not knowing. Over the following months and years, Bindner became a regular presence in Kim's search for Amber. He attended vigils. He distributed flyers. He corresponded with Kim through letters that demonstrated an encyclopedic knowledge of missing persons cases. But there was something unsettling about the intensity of his involvement. Bindner didn't just help search. He inserted himself into every aspect of the investigation. He had theories about what happened to Amber. He suggested places to search. He seemed to know details about the case that hadn't been made public. His van, covered in photos of missing children, became a disturbing symbol of his obsession. Pinole investigators watched him closely. So did the FBI. Because Binder wasn't just interested in Amber's case. He'd also attached himself to the families of Michaela Garrecht and Amanda Campbell, two other girls who had vanished from the Bay Area. He showed up at their homes too, offering his peculiar brand of help. The pattern was unmistakable. Binder appeared at the homes of families with missing daughters within days of the disappearance. He cultivated relationships with the mothers, positioning himself as someone who understood their pain. He became a fixture in their searches, always present, always watching, always taking notes. When police finally searched Bindner's property, they found items that raised alarms. A stone taken from a child's gravestone. A small shirt with no clear origin. Photographs of young girls that had no connection to his family, but they couldn't definitively link any of it to Amber or the other missing girls. Bindner's behavior was profoundly disturbing, yet disturbing wasn't illegal. Suspicion wasn't proof. The investigation consumed years. Bindner was questioned repeatedly. He submitted to polygraph tests, though the results were inconclusive. He allowed searches of his home and vehicle, and through it all he maintained his innocence and his obsessive involvement in missing children cases. He claimed he was simply a concerned citizen, someone who felt compelled to help families in their darkest moments. In 1997, he successfully sued the city of Fairfield for defamation, winning a settlement that seemed to validate his claims that he was merely a concerned citizen with an unusual hobby. The lawsuit arose from statements law enforcement had made, suggesting Bindner might be responsible for disappearances in their jurisdiction. The settlement was a blow to investigators who'd spent years convinced that Bindner was more than just an overeager volunteer. But investigators never stopped wondering, had the man who'd shown up to help Kim search for Amber actually been the one who'd taken her? Was his obsession with missing children a compulsion to relive his crimes? Did he plant the pink socks in the park and then join the search party, savoring the chaos he'd created? Or was he simply what he claimed to be, a strange man with a morbid fascination who couldn't resist inserting himself into tragedies? The answer remained elusive, and while attention focused on Bindner, years slipped past. Amber's 8th birthday came and went, then her 9th, her 10th. The investigation that had begun with hundreds of volunteers searching through the night gradually contracted. Resources shifted to active cases. Tips dried up. The pink socks sat in an evidence locker, a taunt from a perpetrator who'd never been caught. Kim found herself in an impossible position. She needed Bindner's help because he genuinely did work tirelessly on Amber's case. But she also had to consider that the man helping her might be the same man who'd taken her daughter. The psychological torture of that uncertainty was almost unbearable. How do you accept help from someone who might be your enemy? How do you trust, when trust could be exactly what the perpetrator wants? In 1989, Kim Swartz made a decision. If she couldn't find her daughter, she would make sure other mothers had better tools to find theirs. She founded the Amber Foundation for Missing Children. Understanding what Kim Swartz built requires understanding what didn't exist in 1988. There was no national database for missing children's DNA. There was no rapid alert system to broadcast abductions to the public. There were no standardized protocols for how police should respond in the first critical hours. Families were left to navigate their nightmares alone with whatever resources their local department could muster. Kim refused to accept that isolation. The Amber Foundation began with simple goals: create fingerprint identification kits for children, train parents on what to do if their child disappeared, push law enforcement agencies to respond faster, search harder, coordinate better. But Kim's ambitions grew as she educated herself on forensic science. DNA technology was advancing rapidly in the early 1990s, offering unprecedented possibilities for identifying human remains. Yet California had no centralized system for comparing DNA from unidentified bodies with samples from missing persons' families. Remains could sit in morgues for years, while grieving families searched, never knowing their loved ones had already been found. The gap in the system seemed inexcusable to Kim. Science had given law enforcement a tool that could definitively identify remains, yet bureaucratic inertia and budget constraints meant that tool wasn't being fully utilized. Somewhere in California, there might be unidentified remains that belonged to Amber. And without a systematic way to compare DNA, those remains could languish in storage forever. Kim began lobbying the California legislature. She testified at hearings, her voice steady, as she described the agony of not knowing. She met with lawmakers, educating them on the technical aspects of DNA analysis and the practical benefits of a centralized database. She brought other families whose children had vanished, creating a coalition of grief that demanded action. And slowly the system began to change. Assembly Bill 1332 allowed the Department of Justice to compare suspect DNA across multiple investigations simultaneously. This was revolutionary for cold cases. A suspect's DNA collected in one investigation could now be run against evidence from dozens of unsolved crimes. Patterns could emerge. Connections could be made. Serial predators who'd operated across jurisdictions could finally be linked to all their crimes. Chapter 8:21 established post-conviction rights for inmates to request DNA testing, opening pathways to both exoneration and justice. This legislation recognized that DNA technology had advanced beyond what was available when many people were convicted. Inmates who maintained their innocence could now request testing that might prove they'd been wrongly imprisoned. And in some cases, that testing might identify the actual perpetrator. These were significant victories, but they were stepping stones to Kim's larger vision. In the late 1990s, she focused her efforts on Chapter 822, the legislation that would establish the California Missing Persons DNA Databank. This wasn't just a database. This was a state-of-the-art laboratory in Richmond, equipped with automated robotics that could process thousands of DNA samples. The facility would house two programs, connected by a common goal of identifying the unknown. The Cold Hit program would match suspects to crime scenes, helping solve cases where the perpetrator's identity was unknown, but their DNA had been left behind. The Missing Persons DNA program would compare unidentified remains to families' genetic profiles, finally answering the question that haunted people like Kim. Is this my child? When the Richmond lab opened, Kim Swartz stood in the facility she'd fought to create and felt the weight of bittersweet victory. The technology she'd championed would go on to identify hundreds of missing people, bringing closure to families across the nation. She watched technicians load DNA samples into machines that would work through the night, comparing genetic markers with the precision only computers could achieve. Somewhere in those comparisons, families would find answers. Children would be brought home, even if only for burial. But Amber's DNA profile simply waited in the system, a digital ghost, searching for a match that never came. Kim also threw her energy behind what would become the Amber Alert system. Though the program was named after Amber Hagerman, a 9-year-old taken in Texas in 1996, Kim was instrumental in the legislative push to standardize and fund these emergency broadcasts nationwide. She testified before Congress, arguing that the technology existed to notify entire communities within minutes of a child's abduction. Highway signs, television broadcasts, radio announcements could all be coordinated to create a net of awareness that would make it nearly impossible for an abductor to move through populated areas unnoticed. The first 48 hours were critical in child abduction cases. Statistics showed that children who weren't recovered quickly often weren't recovered alive. Amber Alerts compressed the timeline, turning every driver on the highway into a potential witness, every person watching television into an extra set of eyes. The system worked because it leveraged the one resource that always existed but had never been properly mobilized in the past: the public's desperate desire to help. She consulted with states implementing their own systems. She became the face of missing children advocacy, appearing on national news programs and speaking at law enforcement conferences. Mothers across America knew her name, knew her story, knew that if Kim Swartz said something would help find missing children, it was worth fighting for. But she never stopped searching for her own daughter. Every June 3rd, the anniversary of Amber's disappearance, brought renewed media coverage. Every August 19th, Amber's birthday, Kim would look at age progression photos, showing what her daughter might look like now, at 13, at 18, at 25. Each image was a reminder of everything she'd missed. First day of high school, graduation, a wedding that would never happen, grandchildren she would never hold. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the Amber Swartz case remained cold. Binder faded from the headlines after his lawsuit. Investigators periodically reviewed the file, but without new evidence, there was nowhere to go. The jump rope was never found. The person who'd planted the pink socks was never identified. Then, in May 2002, 14 years after Amber vanished, a new name emerged. Stephen Kiesel was a defrocked priest with a history of targeting young girls. And in 1988, he'd lived down the street from the Swartz family. Pinole Police Commander John Miner noted the similarities immediately. Kiesel's known victims matched Amber's age and physical description. He'd had opportunity, means, and a documented pattern of predation. This wasn't someone who'd inserted himself into the investigation like Binder. This was someone who'd been there all along, hiding in plain sight just a few houses away from where Amber lived. The proximity was chilling. Kiesel would have seen Amber playing outside. He would have known the family's routines. He would have known when Kim was likely to be distracted, when Amber was likely to be alone. The opportunistic nature of Amber's abduction suggested someone who'd been watching, waiting for exactly the right moment. Investigators descended on Kiesel's vacation property in Truckee, bringing ground-penetrating radar and excavation teams. News helicopters circled overhead as crews dug into the earth, searching for remains that would finally prove what had happened to Amber Swartz. The media coverage was intense. After 14 years of silence, Kim allowed herself to hope that this might be the answer. They found nothing. Another suspect. Another dead end. Another cycle of hope raised and crushed. Kim watched the Truckee search unfold on television and felt the familiar numbness of disappointment settling over her again. How many times could you let yourself believe before you stopped being able to feel anything at all? The answer, as it turned out, was one more time. In November 2007, 19 years after Amber disappeared, an FBI agent received an unusual request from a California prison. Curtis Dean Anderson was passing away, and he wanted to confess. Curtis Dean Anderson wasn't on anyone's suspect list for Amber Swartz. He'd never lived in Pinole. He'd never been interviewed about the case. But by 2007, he was already serving more than 300 years for other crimes that made investigators' blood run cold. The abduction and ending of 7-year-old Shiana Fairchild in 1999. The taking of Mitzi Sanchez. A pattern of targeting young girls in broad daylight in public places with a boldness that suggested years of practice. Now confined to a prison medical unit and watching his organs fail, Anderson told FBI agents he had more to confess. He wanted to talk about a girl he'd taken in 1988, a blonde child from Pinole, a girl named Amber. The confession came with one condition: no execution. Anderson was already facing multiple life sentences, but he wanted the assurance in writing. The FBI agreed. What did it matter? The man was weeks away from passing on his own. They needed information, and he was the only one who could provide it. Anderson's account was chillingly detailed. He said he'd been driving through Pinole on June 3, 1988, on his way to visit an aunt who owned property near Benson, Arizona. He was working as a cab driver and luggage delivery person at the time, jobs that gave him an intimate knowledge of Bay Area streets and a reason to be traveling in various neighborhoods. He claimed he saw Amber jumping rope in her front yard. The sight of the small blonde girl alone and vulnerable triggered something in him. He pulled over, approached her, and in the space of seconds before anyone could notice or intervene, he forced her into his vehicle. The hearing aid likely meant she never heard him coming. "I wanted company for the drive," he told investigators. As if abducting a 7-year-old child was equivalent to picking up a hitchhiker, the casual nature of his explanation was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the confession. There was no tortured justification, no claim that voices in his head had commanded him. He'd simply wanted company and saw an opportunity to take a child. According to Anderson, he drove through the night toward Arizona. He kept Amber sedated with alcohol, specifically root beer schnapps, to prevent her from crying out at rest stops or traffic lights. The journey took approximately 36 hours. He said he stopped at a motel in the Tucson area, and that's where Amber's life ended. He didn't provide details about exactly what happened in that motel room, and investigators didn't press for them. Some information serves no purpose except to traumatize. Then he drove to the desert near Benson, not far from his aunt's ranch, and left her body where he believed it would never be found. The desert stretched for miles in every direction. Without markers or coordinates, finding remains in that vast expanse would be nearly impossible. The FBI spent 18 months attempting to verify Anderson's claims. They confirmed he'd been working in the Bay Area in June 1988. They confirmed his aunt owned property near Benson. They confirmed that his method matched perfectly with his known pattern of operation. Everything Anderson said was consistent with the facts of the case. Except for one problem. Despite extensive searches of the Arizona desert near Benson, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs and grid patterns that covered miles of terrain, they never found any trace of Amber Swartz. No bones. No clothing. No leather jump rope with wooden handles. Nothing. The absence of physical evidence raised troubling questions. Had Anderson truly disposed of Amber's body in the location he described, or was he lying about where he'd left her, enjoying one final act of control by sending searchers to the wrong place? Desert conditions could scatter and degrade remains, but complete absence of any trace seemed unlikely given the technology available and the thoroughness of the search. In July 2009, Pinole Police Chief Paul Clancy stood before news cameras and announced that after 21 years, the Amber Swartz case was officially closed. Curtis Dean Anderson had taken Amber to Arizona. The mystery was solved. The department could finally move on. There was just one person who refused to accept this resolution: Kim Swartz looked at the confession, at the lack of physical evidence, at the convenient timing of an ending man seeking one final moment of infamy, and said the word that would reopen everything. For most families, a confession from a known serial predator would bring a form of closure, however painful. The not knowing is often described as worse than the worst truth. At least with an answer you can grieve. You can bury the uncertainty, if not the body. You can stop wondering if your child is out there somewhere alive and suffering, waiting to be rescued. But Kim Swartz had spent 2 decades becoming an expert in forensic science and criminal investigation. She'd learned to question easy answers. She'd seen how Binder had consumed years of investigative resources despite never being conclusively linked to any crime. She'd watched the Kiesel lead evaporate after the Truckee excavation found nothing. She knew that sometimes the explanation that seems most convenient is simply the one that allows everyone else to move on. And she knew Curtis Dean Anderson's reputation. He was a narcissist who craved attention and control. He was passing away, facing the absolute end of his ability to manipulate and terrorize. What better final act than to solve a famous cold case, ensuring his name would be remembered alongside his victims? He couldn't be prosecuted, he couldn't face trial, but he could claim credit for an unsolved disappearance and take satisfaction in knowing that people would be talking about him for years to come. Kim's objections were methodical and evidence-based. If Anderson had taken Amber to Arizona in June 1988, who had planted the pink socks in the Pinole Park on the morning of June 4th, the timeline didn't work unless Anderson had an accomplice, and there was no evidence of one. If he'd left Amber's body in the desert near Benson, why had exhaustive searches found absolutely nothing? Modern forensic technology could locate remains years after burial. Bone fragments persist, clothing fibers survive. Even in harsh desert conditions, something should have been found. Most tellingly, why should anyone believe a confession from a man who'd lied throughout his entire criminal career? Anderson had no incentive to tell the truth. He couldn't be prosecuted. He was already serving multiple life sentences. The only thing confession could give him was legacy, the twisted satisfaction of knowing people would speak his name for decades to come. Kim went public with her doubts. She gave interviews challenging the department's decision to close the case. She appeared on national news programs, using her platform as a respected advocate to question the validity of accepting a confession without physical proof. She argued that as long as the case was officially solved, no resources would be allocated to continuing the search. New leads wouldn't be pursued. Advancements in DNA technology wouldn't be applied to Amber's profile. Her daughter would be forgotten in the rush to check a box and move on. The Pinole Police Department pushed back. Chief Clancy defended the decision, citing the corroborating evidence and Anderson's credible knowledge of details. He argued that Anderson's pattern of operation matched the Amber Swartz case perfectly. The confession made sense. It fit the facts. Without physical remains, this was as close to certainty as they were likely to get. But Kim had something more powerful than the department's desire for closure. She had a national platform built over 2 decades of advocacy. She had relationships with lawmakers and forensic experts across the country. She had the respect of law enforcement agencies who'd implemented the systems she'd fought to create. She had credibility that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. And she had the absolute unwillingness of a mother to give up. For 4 years, Kim campaigned to reopen her daughter's case. She filed formal petitions with the Pinole Police Department. She gathered expert opinions from forensic scientists who questioned the wisdom of closing a case without physical evidence. She used every tool she'd developed as an advocate to pressure the city of Pinole into reconsidering. Other families of missing children rallied to her cause, understanding that if Kim Swartz couldn't get answers with all her resources and expertise, what hope did any of them have? She made a compelling argument. Genetic genealogy was advancing at a stunning pace. Techniques that hadn't existed in 2009 were now solving cold cases that had been considered hopeless. Every month brought news of another Jane Doe identified, another family given closure through DNA analysis that went beyond simple matching. If Amber's remains were out there somewhere, new technology might finally find them, but only if the case remained active. In 2013, a new police chief, John Hardister, reviewed the case with fresh eyes. He looked at the lack of physical evidence. He considered the rapid advancement in genetic genealogy technology. He weighed the department's need for closure against a mother's need for certainty. He also recognized the optics of the situation. Kim Swartz had built systems that had helped law enforcement solve hundreds of cases. She deserved the courtesy of keeping her daughter's case active, and he made a decision that was nearly unprecedented in law enforcement. He officially reopened the Amber Swartz case. The status changed from closed to endangered missing. Amber's profile was reactivated in every database. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children updated her age progression photos, showing what she might look like at 33 years old. The search that had supposedly ended in 2009 was officially active again. Kim had won, but winning meant accepting that she might search for the rest of her life without ever finding proof. It meant living in the permanent suspension between probable truth and absolute certainty. It meant knowing that Curtis Dean Anderson had likely taken her daughter while being unable to prove it, unable to confront him, unable to demand he reveal where he'd truly left Amber's remains. Because Anderson had passed away in December 2007, just 1 month after his confession. Whatever secrets he held, whatever truth he might have eventually revealed under persistent questioning went with him. He took his final satisfaction in that. The mystery remained his to own. Today, Kim Swartz is 67 years old. She has spent 37 years searching for Amber. That's more than twice as long as her daughter lived. It's longer than many marriages last. It's longer than most careers span. It's an entire adult lifetime dedicated to a question that may never be answered. Every morning, Kim checks the databases. She monitors reports of unidentified remains discovered in the Southwest, particularly in Arizona, where Anderson claimed to have left Amber's body. She reviews Jane Doe cases looking for any detail that might match. Blonde hair, age-appropriate height and weight, dental records showing a missing right front tooth. The hearing aid would be long gone, deteriorated in the desert heat, but other markers might persist. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children continues to create age progression images. In 2019, they released a rendering showing what Amber might look like at 39 years old. The technology has become remarkably sophisticated, using familial features from Kim and archived photos of Bernie Swartz, combined with aging algorithms that predict how bone structure changes over decades. The woman in the photo looks like someone you might pass on the street at a grocery store in a parking lot. She looks real and alive and aging in ways Amber never got to experience. The Richmond DNA laboratory that Kim fought to establish has become one of the premier facilities in the nation for identifying missing persons. The automated systems she championed have brought closure to hundreds of families. Remains that sat unnamed in morgues for years have been matched to DNA samples from desperate relatives. Cold cases have been solved. People who vanished decades ago have finally been brought home to families who never stopped searching, just not Amber. The database holds her genetic profile alongside thousands of others' digital ghosts waiting for a match. Every time a hiker finds bones in the desert, every time construction crews unearth remains, every time a Jane Doe appears in the system, the computers run comparisons. Algorithms search for familial connections for genetic markers that suggest relation. Someday, perhaps the computer will flag a match. Someday, Kim's phone might ring with the news she's both desperate for and terrified of receiving. The Amber Alert system, which Kim helped champion through its legislative battles, has successfully recovered hundreds of abducted children. The alerts flash across highway signs and phone screens, mobilizing entire communities within minutes of a report. The first 48 hours matter most in child abduction cases, and Amber Alerts have compressed response times from hours to minutes. Lives have been saved because Kim Swartz channeled her grief into systemic change. But none of those successes erase the fundamental absence. None of the children brought home by Amber Alerts are Amber. None of the remains identified through the Richmond Lab's DNA program belong to the 7-year-old who vanished from Savage Avenue on June 3, 1988. Kim has built a legacy that will outlive her. The systems she created will continue identifying missing persons long after she's gone. Her advocacy changed how America responds to child abduction. She transformed her personal tragedy into public policy that protects millions. Universities teach her legislative campaigns as case studies in effective advocacy. Law enforcement agencies hold her up as an example of how civilian pressure can improve professional practice. Yet she would trade it all for 15 minutes, for the chance to go back to that Friday afternoon and make a different choice. to keep Amber inside, to watch her more carefully, to trust the instinct that made her hesitate before saying yes. The bargain seems so simple in retrospect. Everything she's accomplished against those 15 minutes. Everything she's built against one ordinary afternoon when she let her daughter play outside. Our community understands this arithmetic of grief. We know how mothers measure time in before and after. We felt the weight of decisions that seemed inconsequential until they became everything. Most of us never experienced tragedy on Kim's scale, but we've all had our moments of looking back and wondering what if. What if I'd turned left instead of right? What if I'd answered that call? What if I'd listened to the small voice that said, wait? Kim has lived with what if for 37 years. She's learned to build a life on top of unresolved grief, to create meaning from loss, to keep moving forward while never moving on. That's a particular kind of strength our generation recognizes. We were raised to persist, to find purpose, to channel pain into something productive. We watched our mothers and grandmothers do it through wars and depressions and the ordinary losses that accumulate across a lifetime. We've done it ourselves through divorces and health scares, and the slow accumulation of smaller losses that come with aging. But Kim's persistence exists on a scale that makes even the strongest among us wonder how she keeps going. The answer, perhaps, is that she has no choice. Stopping would mean abandoning Amber, and a mother doesn't abandon her child, not even when that child has been gone for nearly 4 decades, not even when the logical part of her brain accepts what probably happened, not even when everyone else has moved on. The case of Amber Swartz teaches us uncomfortable truths about safety and vigilance. It happened in broad daylight on a residential street in a town that prided itself on being safe. It happened to the daughter of a slain police officer, a child the entire community had promised to protect. It happened in 15 minutes, while a mother was inside her own home, close enough to hear the jump rope hitting the pavement. If it could happen to Amber, it could happen to anyone. This isn't meant to terrify, but to inform. Our generation raised children in an era when we were just beginning to understand that danger doesn't always look suspicious. It doesn't always drive a creepy van or lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes it looks ordinary. Sometimes it strikes in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Curtis Dean Anderson was a cab driver, someone whose job gave him a reason to be in neighborhoods. He looked like he belonged. That's what made him dangerous. What can we do with this knowledge? How do we honor Amber's memory and Kim's legacy? We pay attention. When someone in our neighborhood shows too much interest in children who aren't theirs, we notice. When an adult asks a child for help finding a lost puppy or asks for directions, we intervene. Because adults don't need children's help. Ever. That simple rule has saved lives. Predators use these tactics because they work. They ask for help or offer help because it gives them a reason to engage with a child, to create a moment of trust that can be exploited. We report what we see even when we feel foolish, even when we worry about being the nosy neighbor who causes trouble over nothing. The alternative is staying silent, when silence could cost a life. There are anonymous tip lines for exactly this purpose. Law enforcement would rather investigate 100 false reports than miss the one that could have prevented a tragedy. Better to make a call that turns out to be nothing than to fail to make the call that could have changed everything. We support families of the missing, not just in the first desperate weeks when the news cameras are present, but years later when the rest of the world has forgotten. We say their loved one's name. We attend anniversaries and vigils. We send cards on birthdays that will never be celebrated. We remember that for these families, time doesn't heal. It just accumulates. The pain doesn't fade. It transforms into something they learn to carry, but it never gets lighter. We teach the children in our lives, whether our own grandchildren or the kids in our neighborhoods, to trust their instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If an adult makes them uncomfortable, they should tell someone they trust. We give them permission to be rude if someone violates their boundaries. We teach them that politeness is worth less than safety, that it's okay to say no to adults, that screaming and running and making a scene is exactly the right response when threatened. We know the resources that exist now because of advocates like Kim Swartz. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children operates a 24-hour hotline. The number is 1-800-THE-LOST. They have counselors trained to guide families through the first crucial hours. They coordinate with law enforcement. They create and distribute posters. They maintain databases of missing children that are updated in real time. NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, maintains a free database accessible to anyone. You can search for missing persons by physical characteristics, by location, by date of disappearance. You can also search unidentified remains, looking for matches to missing loved ones. The system that Kim helped create is available to every family that needs it. Local Amber Alert systems can be activated within minutes of a report. Highway signs change, text messages go out, television and radio stations interrupt programming. Entire communities mobilize because someone pressed a button and sent information racing across communication networks. These systems exist because families demanded them, fought for them, refused to accept that children should vanish without every possible resource being deployed. If a child in your life goes missing, you call 911 immediately. There is no waiting period for children. The myth that you have to wait 24 hours before reporting a missing person is dangerous and false. Every minute matters. You preserve items with their scent for search dogs. You gather recent photos, the more recent the better. You collect their toothbrush for DNA testing. You accept every offer of help and delegate tasks to others because you cannot coordinate a search alone while your world is ending. And you remember that mothers like Kim Swartz built the systems that might save that child. They built them from grief and fury, and the refusal to let their loss be meaningless. Amber Swartz Garcia would be 44 years old now. She would have lived through the technology revolution, seen the internet transform from novelty to necessity, watched smartphones become extensions of human consciousness. She would have been part of the generation that grew up analog and adapted to digital. She might have children of her own by now, might have made Kim a grandmother several times over. She might have become a teacher inspired by the community that rallied to search for her, or an artist finding ways to express emotions too complex for words, or an engineer building systems that solve problems, or a social worker helping families navigate crises. She might have traveled the world or never left California. She might have inherited her father's sense of service or her mother's gift for advocacy. We will never know. Curtis Dean Anderson's confession probably holds the truth of what happened in that Arizona motel room in that desert near Benson. Probably. The timeline fits. His pattern of operation matches. His knowledge of details suggests genuine involvement, but probably isn't the same as certainly, and Kim Swartz has earned the right to demand certainty. The case remains open. The investigation continues. Every few months, genetic genealogy experts consult on new techniques for extracting usable DNA from degraded samples. Private companies like Othram, which specializes in forensic genealogy, have offered their services. They've solved cases where traditional DNA analysis failed, building genetic profiles from bone fragments that seemed too degraded to yield useful information. Every time remains are discovered in the Southwest, Amber's profile runs through the comparison system. The technology Kim fought to create keeps searching for her daughter, even as she ages into her late 60s, even as the likelihood of finding anything after 37 years approaches zero. Is this hope or denial? Is Kim's refusal to accept Anderson's confession an act of courage or an inability to face truth? The answer is probably both, probably neither. The answer is that she's a mother who lost her child and refuses to stop looking, and that's all the explanation required. No one gets to judge how long a mother searches. No one gets to decide when she should accept an answer that can't be proven. Every child recovered because of these systems owes their life in part to a mother who channeled her grief into legislation. That's a legacy more powerful than most people achieve in a lifetime of deliberate effort. Watch for the children in your neighborhoods. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Report what you see, even when you feel foolish. Because somewhere right now another child is playing outside while a mother watches from the window. And the systems Kim Swartz fought for, the databases and alerts and protocols born from her refusal to accept her daughter's loss as meaningless, might be the only thing standing between an ordinary afternoon and endless searching. Amber is still missing, but because of her, thousands aren't. And perhaps that's the only answer that matters when perfect answers refuse to come.